We are going to have to account for all the places we trade courage for comfort, dedication for distraction, and inspiration for information. Put simply, as we untangle this tale, it's going to get worse before it gets better. This is a quote from our next guest, a worldwide disruptor in Disrupt Everything podcast series. Today we have Jamie Wheal. Jamie, welcome to Disrupt Everything podcast series.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now we jump in to Disrupt Everything podcast series, which is a place for human potential and deconstructing and dissecting worldwide disruptors, his routines, habits, his performances, space for holistic high performance, space for unlocking this human potential that we all have inside of us, and also bring the best of our own disruption to the world and reinvent ourselves to reinvent everything. Now it's time for Jamie Wheal. Jamie, this is podcast somehow 201, 202. Jamie is the author of the global bestseller and Pulitzer Prize nominated Stealing Fire, and the founder of the Flow Genome Project, an international organization dedicated to the research of training ultimate human performance. Since founding the organization in 2011, it has gone on become the leading voice of evidence-based peak performance in the world, counting award-winning academics, legendary professional athletes, special operation commanders, and Fortune 500 business leaders among the hundreds of thousands of people in its global community. Jamie is an expert on peak performance and leadership, specializing in the neuroscience and application of flow states. He has advised everyone from the U.S. Naval War College and a Special Operations Command, the athletes of Red Bull, and the owners of NFL, NBA, MLB, and Premier League teams, to the executive of Google's, Goldman Sachs, Deloitte, Cisco, and young presidents' organizations. His work and ideas have covered the New York Times, Financial Times, Wired Entrepreneur, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and TED. He has spoken at Stanford, MIT, Harvard Club, Imperial College, the Bohemian Club, the United Nations, Singularity University, and Summit Series. Jamie is currently in wilderness guiding. He has rescued people from the Atlantic Ocean during a hurricane, taken a youngest group of Americans ever to Camp 3 on the north face of Mount Everest, and taken CEOs into the Grand Canyon for a week of war games. The Seattle Seahawks coaching staff has shared his leadership models during Super Bowl halftime, and Navy SEAL instructors study Stealing Fire as required reading. He practices kitesurf, heli-ski, and downhill mountain bike in the mountains and oceans of the world. Now, Jamie is presenting his new book, Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World That Has Lost Its Mind, with HarperCollins. This is a peak performance expert who maps out a revolutionary new practice, hedonic engineering, that combines the best of neuroscience and optimal psychology. It's an intensive program of breathing, movement, and sexuality that mends trauma, heightens inspiration, and tightens connections, helping us wake up, grow up, and show up for a world that needs us all. And it just took a quote from the book, and he says, if we can do the work and recapture the rapture, we might finally evolve from Homo sapiens, the ape who knows, to Homo ludens, the ape who plays. it seems to me, the children, as Buddha said. Jamie, again, thank you for your time, and thank you for making this appearance in Disrupt Everything podcast series. We are happy to have you.
Oh, thank you. Well, that was a very kind and lengthy introduction, but just so listeners, I think, can just boil it all down. I've just been forever curious about how do we as humans grow and develop. So where have we come from? What's going on? And what do we do now? So really, you can boil all the fancy stuff down, and the sort of resume list of people I've been fortunate enough to speak to, advise, work with, just down to that, just this inquiry of what does it mean to be humans on this earth, and what does it mean to wake up to the depth of that answer at a time of massively accelerating change and consequence. So that's really the short one that I think we can all kind of hopefully find ourselves and our own inquiries into.
This is one I have. This is one of the most exciting interviews for me. I've been following your work since a bit when I discovered Stealing Fire, and I've been in talks with John, who also big shout out to John for also helping it to make it happen. And it's been a beautiful journey to have the chance to interview you. So I hope you enjoy as much as I'm enjoying. And the first question to start the interview, which is one, I think is the one single, the only one question that I always repeat with every guest in this podcast after this research, and also reading, following your talks and TED talks, and all the one in Summit, the one in the site. I think it was in the psychedelic when you were with the also Paul Austin, right? And
Okay.
and so after following this, your work and such an impressive career and projects, what will be your, if we were about to put your life into a timeline, what will be your top or most impactful milestones?
How many do you want?
Up to
3,
you.
5? I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I've spent most of my life assuming that everybody had the same inner thoughts or process or experiences that I did, and I've spent the second half of my life, especially with increasingly sassy children, realizing that maybe I don't, like maybe I'm a mutant or something. But in general, right, my milestones were, probably sort of, late teens in college, university, and getting exposed to um, three things really: kind of music, mountains, and mushrooms. Like basically um, outdoor adventure sports in beautiful nature, because I never fully understood human society very well. It always confused me. I found its rules baffling or illegitimate. I didn't understand the games that people appeared to play, the kind of social games. They never left me fulfilled or happy or even on the inside of winning them. So I was very much kind of a sort of an outsider, because I had also come from England at an early age. I was immersed in a school system and things that were very, very foreign to me. I was 2 years younger than my classmates. So I was very much just kind of just like, what the hell is happening here? So for me, the natural sublime, just beautiful, wild places, were much more soothing than social environments. And um, and using my body, almost, like to not necessarily life and death, but high consequence situations, whether that was, windsurfing during a lightning storm, in 30 knots of wind, or whether it was skiing, whatever I could find that would be really, really challenging. I found that getting into my body by doing gravity sports was the best way for me to get out of my head. So I'm terrible at meditating, mindfulness, sitting on a pillow, trying not to think about my thinking. But I love getting onto a bike or a stand-up paddleboard or backcountry skiing or whatever it would be, and that the rhythms and the embodiment surrounded by beautiful nature was a place that I found instantly soothing and rewarding. And then at the same time, plus or minus a year or two, came across live improvisational music in large communities, and those live improvisational, music groups tended to coordinate with psychedelics, and the combination of nature plus improvisational music plus community. So those music communities or communitas, where everybody is dropped into the same experience and everybody is kind of one with the band or the DJ or whatever it might be. Those are some of the first times I felt at home with a large group of other people. So that was really beautiful. And not to mention that particularly the kind of music that co-evolved with those gatherings was another way to get into moving meditation, because the songs really weren't songs with a beginning, a middle, an end, and a chorus and lyrics and a refrain. They were much more 10 to 15-minute exploratory sonic journeys that you could offload your default mode network, you could offload your waking consciousness onto, and just go on this adventure. And to me, that was another form of kind of kinetic acoustic meditation. They were really beautiful domains to explore. And then the final one would be marriage or long-term partnership. So I met my life partner when I was 18. We were in college. We explored all of these things together, the music, mountains, and the mushrooms. And so the fourth one would be marriage, and not just deep connected relationship, of which there's profound lessons, but also dyadic partnership. And what does it mean to be romantically engaged, and then also explore physical intimacy over time with a dedicated partner, to me, in a way that's most akin or similar to sort of high altitude mountaineering. Like you choose, like if you're rock climbing in a gym, like in a city, everything's safe. The anchors are bolted to the ceiling. They even have electrical winches up and down. You can tie yourself in, and you can really just choose to climb with whoever you want. So sport climbing is a little bit like sport fucking, right? It's very low consequence, and you kind of go with who looks the best in lycra. And there's not much riding on the quality of that relationship. It can be fun, it can be brief, right? It can be whatever it's going to be. But high altitude mountaineering is very different, right? You select your partner not just for who can pump plastic, who can climb the highest grade in a safe indoor environment, but much more who can be hanging off the side of a mountain in a 6-day storm and not lose their mind, who can push and find depth in a place where most people would crumple or fail or panic, who can get you safely back to the trailhead, or to the helicopter if something goes badly wrong. So the criteria for selecting deep lifelong partnership, I think, are fundamentally different than what we've seen in the kind of swipe right hookup culture world. And the chance there is, would you rather drill 1,000 wells 1 foot deep, or one well 1,000 feet deep? So between those experiences, that set the course of my life, the course of my career, our adventures and explorations around the world in oceans and mountains and canyons and and forests, and also has fueled the central question of my life, which is, how do we balance the agony and the ecstasy? Right? I mean, how do we, if the peak experiences that are increasingly widely available to more people on this planet than have ever been. Because if you think back in the day, it was either a priest class or an esoteric group of monks or a shaman on the edge of the jungle or forest who had maybe one or two apprentices and, kind of doled out the experiences. We have open sourced peak states these days. And the psychedelic renaissance is a part of that. Electronic music culture. There's a thousand, biohacking. There's 1,001 avenues into this terrain, which was the kind of subject of Stealing Fire. But also, if that's true, right? If we can have these amazing moments where we feel whole, where we feel connected and part of things, where we may even have access to heightened information and cognitive and creative processing, and it might even seem that there is some sort of higher information that we can sort of dip our toes into and learn from. If that's true or possible, then how on earth can there also be all of this acute suffering? And whether that's inequalities of race, class, gender, environmental justice, you name it, and then fast forward to right now, these days, geopolitical conflict, ecosystemic collapse, all of these kind of things, you're like, oh my gosh, are we at this amazingly rare inflection point in history where we are simultaneously coming alive into our fullest potential, just in time to look around, and realize, oh shit, we might be sailing off a cliff, and we might have to really start wondering about staying alive. How do we prepare for a turbulent, uncertain future? And how do we balance those two things, the coming alive of infinite expansion, possibility, joy, love, bliss, adventure, fulfillment, growth, you name it, both for ourselves, individual people, but also for our society? We're going to stamp out racism, classism, sexism, all the isms, and the very same techno-industrial society that we've grown up in that's provided the foundation for all of these wonderful experiences, including light shows and sound systems and pharmacology and a liberal civil society that lets us experiment with who we are and all these things. The very same foundational techno-industrial society is also bafflingly, crazily, potentially responsible for cooking our goose and sending us off the cliff of the collapse of a late stage empire. So for me, it's been, sometimes I get identified as a performance expert, but really that never sits very well or accurately with me. It's much more neuroanthropology, like who are we and where have we come from? What are these habits and customs and behaviors that we have evolved over 100,000 years? And then that's the anthropology part. But then also the neuro part, which is, and what is under the hood of all these strange behaviors and customs? And are there biomechanical, are there body brain explanations for things that prop up across time and space, across thousands of years in different cultures all around the world, that unite them? And we're like, oh, that's what we're doing. That's what's going on. And so if we understand that, then we can look. We now understand the functional building blocks. It's like Lego. You've got the pieces, and now how do we look into the future and engage in what you could call culture architecture? How do we evolve, innovate, redesign society and culture so that it is healthier, so that it is more inclusive, so that it is more sustainable, so that it harnesses the better angels of our nature, and that we don't end up in the ditch of the worst animal instincts or impulses that we also have in our conflicted human experience.
And two questions from here is, one is, what are these essential or these critical building blocks, and why the world has lost his mind, and if is there any antidote? Three questions, in fact.
Say that last bit again.
Why the world has lost his mind, and is there any antidote? I was saying that three questions, in fact, not two.
Yeah. So, I think one thing that is interesting, and so I'll try and answer the first two together because they sort of go together, which is, we are in the grips of a meaning crisis, right? The idea that, quote unquote, what's really going on can be answered in a fragmented, fractured way right now. And it is more fragmented and fractured than probably ever. And that has been, in part, this is a simplification, but hopefully it's a helpful one, which is that we used to rely for, 90, let's think, what are we looking at now? 90, 9,750 years, we relied on organized religions to tell us who we are, how to act, what was our place in the universe, what was the hierarchy of people, how was our society supposed to act, etc. And so that was a very strong source of help me understand what's really going on. That attendance and membership in organized religions has been rapidly decreasing over the last several decades, really through the 20th century, but accelerating in the last 10 to 20 years. And now, for the first time in human history, more people don't belong to an organized religion than do. Which, if you think about it, back in the day, if you did, that was a risky move. You were considered a heretic. You were
Indeed.
considered a pagan. You were considered an apostate. Whatever the name was, you were basically booted from care and concern, and quite often hunted down, burned at the stake, in prison, persecuted, whatever it would be. So to say, thanks, I'm not playing your game, was incredibly rare and incredibly high risk. So, and at the same time, the 1700s on, you have the European Enlightenment, you have the advent of God is dead, the five senses, empiricism, scientific materialism. We kind of had the rise of what you could call modern liberalism. And liberal not as in like Democrat or Marxist, just liberalism in the sense of private property, free markets, civil rights, the kind of classical liberalism. And for a long time, especially in the 20th and early 21st centuries, that would kind of became our new God, right? You would look at journals, you would believe in science, you would follow the technocrats, the people who were in, which are now being vilified as the deep state. There was deference to non-governmental organizations like the World Health Organization or the CDC or the World Bank or whatever these things are. But in the last 10 years in particular, post-Soviet Union collapse, definitely took a ding in the 2008 financial crisis, took another ding with COVID and quarantine and the absolutely kludgy, clearly not professional or consistent governmental and authority responses to that. They're continuing right up to this minute. And then throw in how it kind of ripped back the Band-Aid of social injustices, inequities, the kind of Black Lives Matter protests, all of these things that have been rippling around the world. Goldman Sachs and McKinsey being exposed for just being money-grubbing bastards, Deutsche Bank, laundering trillions of dollars of Russian mafia money, like everybody that the Catholic Church and pedophile scandals, like pretty much any organization or institution that we used to give authority to, CNN and its current scandals around putting the thumb on the scale in their anti-Trump news selections, all of these things have just blown people's minds. And so we were moving away from the certainty of organized religion. We were leaning on the evidence-based accuracy of modern liberalism, and both of those pillars have kind of crumbled. And so our meaning crisis has left us not standing in the middle on our own 2 feet with clarity and sort of empowerment. It's, sort of nature abhors a vacuum, but so does culture. And into that vacuum, we have had people getting sucked to fundamentalism, right? Fervent literalist beliefs, and not just religious fundamentalism. And when we say fundamentalism, you either think typically Islamic suicide bombers or Christian evangelicals, right? But you also have fundamentalists who are blockchain fundamentalists, libertarian fundamentalists. We have CrossFit and paleo vegan fundamentalists, right? You have all sorts of, the world is crazy and chaotic and I'm losing my mind. This is not comfortable or pleasant. So I'm going to latch on to a very fixed and rigid explanation of what's really going on. So fundamentalism of any stripe, sacred or secular. Or if that's not your cup of tea, many people are getting sucked over to nihilism, right? We're fucked. There is no truth, and there's nothing I can do about it. And so we're seeing this rise of diseases of despair, depression, anxiety, addiction, all the way to suicide. You're seeing more people killing themselves than are dying from all war and all natural disasters combined. Which, if you think about your news feed, what do we see? We see fires, floods, military conflict. That's kind of, that's the things that are constantly in our doom scrolling news feeds. And then you're realizing, whoa, this silent killer of people just saying, I want out. Like, this gift of human life is insufficient to keep a
Wow.
million people a year choosing it and just saying, I'm out. None of this makes sense, and it doesn't look like it's going to. So that is arguably the meaning crisis, right? And as we have been experiencing this has been a slow motion train wreck, right, over decades. This isn't sort of, it's sort of suddenly, and it's the old Hemingway thing of how, it's the old Hemingway quote of how do you go bankrupt? It's slowly and then suddenly and all at once, right? So it's kind of been like, it's been decadal. And, people like Sam Harris, who was talking about the end of faith and all of these kind of things, the new atheism, we're kind of saying, like, it's good to get rid of our superstitious religious beliefs, right? They don't do anything good for us. Christopher Hitchens would be another example of that, right? And for a while, it sort of seemed like we were sort of shaking off the shackles of religious superstition, the opiate of the masses kind of stuff. And then we were all going to be rational materialists and make, clever data-informed decisions. We haven't. But there's something really important about religion, because when sociologists study it, they have found pretty consistently that being a practicing member of a community of faith, isn't just opium. It actually leaves you healthier, wealthier, and happier than if you didn't believe. And what's really interesting is that it doesn't matter what you believe in, right? So it doesn't matter who your God is or what your commandments are. It matters that you believe in them and that you are engaged in an active community of faith or practice. So you realize, oh, there's important, like, religion wouldn't have persisted for 10,000 plus years if it didn't have an evolutionarily adaptive contribution. It would just fade away, right? And so when sociologists have been studying this, and psychologists too, that they've come to the conclusion, and the Harvard Sacred Design Lab sort of identified these three things, which was healing, inspiration, and connection. These are the essential nutrients. So this was your second question, right? These are your essential nutrients of how we thrive and survive, which is, if we don't have inspiration, like moments of renewal and affirmation that there is a point to this whole human thing, right? Then the mundane grind of life will crush us, right? And that's the suicides and the diseases of despair. If we don't have access to healing, then the invariable traumas of life, the adverse childhood events, the adverse adult events, and just the micro PTSD stressors. We've all been experiencing this in the last couple of years of quarantine, right? Our whole lives and balances and rhythms and relationships have all been wildly disrupted. And many people are just starting to crack, not from a single traumatic event, but just from a little bit of trauma every single day, day in, day out. And it accumulates. So we can call that, so there's macro PTSD. Those are the big hits, the broken bones, the fights, the rapes, the abuses, the violence. Those are the macros. But there's also the micro PTSDs, and we're all suffering from that. So if we don't have healing, if we don't have a way to metabolize our grief, if we don't have a way to sort of defrag our nervous systems and get back to center, get back to zero or homeostasis, a place where we are in sync and in balance, then we will become diseased. And then finally, and traditional versions, whether it's Yom Kippur, whether it's Ramadan, whether it's Lent, there's all sorts of, every culture has built in some period of atonement, forgiveness, renewal, right? And those serve vital, vital functions. So we need the inspiration, or the mundane will crush us. We need the healing, or our trauma will choke us. And we need connection, because we are social tribal primates. And everybody trots out the Hungarian orphanage studies and those kind of things under Ceausescu and those kind of things. But that there's truth to, we die in isolation. And a huge chunk of the diseases of despair that we're all suffering under these days are due in part to isolation. And Vivek Murthy, the current US Surgeon General, has written a book called Together, and identifies, the loneliness of the modern individual as one of the major mental health challenges and crises. We grew up in small bands of hunter gatherers, right? We were then in villages and towns. That was kind of this, everybody knew everybody, Dunbar numbers of 150 people, all that kind of argument. And then in the 20th century, there was the move to urban areas. People, you couldn't survive on your farms. You had to come to the urban core to seek your fortune in a sweatshop or a factory or something like that. There was increased social mobility, but there was also familial dislocation. There was we were sold on the upside. If you can move anywhere you want, you can reinvent yourself, you can pick up any profession. You don't have to be limited to your family of origin, your religion, your ethnicity. Anybody can grow up to be president was the upside of that. But then the downside was I have no idea who I am. I've moved 5 times in my life chasing jobs. My parents, are in another state or another country being cared for in a nursing home by strangers on minimum wage. My social identity is on dating apps and Instagram and Twitter. I have a constructed digital persona that isn't really me, and no
Mm.
one knows me at all. And quite likely, I live by myself. And so I have 5,000 friends on Facebook, and I go home every night to watch Netflix alone and swipe right to see if anybody likes me. So, so connection.
That's
So
powerful.
healing, inspiration, and connection, right? You're like, oh my gosh, these are timeless. They're sort of non-negotiable nutrients that we need, that old school religion used to provide. Now it provided it with all the downsides that it came with. It was insular. It was, it offered salvation. Like if you believe in this body of beliefs, you're saved. But if you don't, you're not. So it was exclusive salvation, right? So that was the trade-off,
What
right?
what were your drive? What drive you to to write to write this book, and also the recapture, the rapture, and on going on this search of humankind, kind of purpose, healing, mm, mm, quest.
Hmm. Well, I'll tell you what. Let me finish one more sentence because then we've got the bookends,
Ah,
right? So,
okay.
so in this meaning crisis, right, we are suffering fundamentalism and nihilism. No one knows what's going on. It's easy for modern, intellectuals to dismiss and belittle traditional religion, but it offered those 3 essential nutrients: the healing, inspiration, and connection. So those are important. We shouldn't forget them. But the problem was that traditional religions offered salvation. They offered the healing, inspiration, and connection, but at the price of exclusion, right? So that doesn't match our modern sensibilities of everybody's entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of race, color, or creed, right? So modern liberalism offered inclusion, but at the price of salvation. No one's going to tell you what it all means, and no one's going to point to a single God or a single narrative. So we've all been lost to make it up for ourselves. So the question is what does meaning 3.0, if 1.0 was traditional religion and 2.0 was modern liberalism, and both are crumbling and we're suffering because of that, what does meaning 3.0 look like that can offer inclusive salvation, right? A sense of being
Mhm.
and becoming and connecting that works for everybody. So to your question, why am I curious about this? It's been an inevitable unfolding from back in university, right? Because I would have those experiences at night, magical, mystical, wonderful experiences. And my mutant brain is just wired to wonder. And then I would go back into history classes, back into anthropology classes, back into literature classes, and I would be designing my own. I had a lot of leeway in this program that I was in, so I could design a lot of my own studies. And I was kind of like, what is this hidden lineage? Somewhere through history, through time and space, there have been the keepers of the light. There have been people that have been bringing this magical, mystical, initiatory, beautiful state of consciousness, way of being through. But it doesn't feel like it's just one time, one place in history. You can be like, oh, look, those guys had it going on. It's the Taoists in China, or it's the Stoics in Greece, or it's the Epicureans, or it's the Native Americans, or it's the Sufis, or whomever, right? It felt like it was this sort of, invisible college. It was this hidden lineage, and it would pop up in one time and place, and then it would get stamped out, and then it would disappear, and then it would bubble up someplace else, and you'd be like, well, there it is. And you could tell, you'd see a thinker or a philosopher or a poet or a statesman, and you'd be like, oh, they have it going on, right? They've got the shine. What's that invisible lineage? And so Stealing Fire was effectively a sort of 25-year love letter, to me, tracing that, because I went to grad school to be like, okay, where did we go wrong? Where did Western civilization go wrong? Because clearly you look around and you see Walmart, and you see traffic jams, and you see worker drones, and you see environmental pollution and degradation. You're like, this is not our best effort, clearly. And not only is it not our best effort, if you look back through human civilization, but it also appears to be self-terminating. We're going to catch all the fish and chop down all the redwoods, and hunt out all the animals. I mean, the amount of plastic in the world now outweighs all living creatures in terms of biomass, and humans and their domesticated animals now account for 96% of all living things on the planet. There's only 4% that are wild and free creatures, which I believe includes all the fish in the oceans, which is horrifying.
Crazy.
Right? So we have entered the Anthropocene era, right? Which is no longer the Holocene. It's no longer a time of evolutionary and geologic forces. It's a time when mankind, humanity, and its technology have a greater influence on the shaping of things and the developments of things than any other more natural, longer term forces. So I was like, okay, we took a wrong turn somewhere. Where was it? And so in graduate school, I was just deeply studying the clash of civilizations between European colonialism and indigenous cultures around the world. So rather than like the Dances with Wolves kind of story of like, and then they were all, all the indigenous people were killed or removed to reservations, and alcoholism and despair ensued. I was like, let's rewind the clock. Let's go back to like the 1600s and the 1700s and see what was happening when it was still a fair fight. What was happening when you could really see the intersection of these cultures, and you could really learn about who had a better thing going on. And interestingly, David Graeber, his recent book, The Dawn of Everything, is a revisiting of that. Yuval Harari's Sapiens was a revisiting of that. Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, that was the kind of wheelhouse that I was just deeply fascinated by. So where did we go wrong, if at all? And where was there a fork in the road that we might retrace our steps to get back on track? So that was the original inquiry. And that's still, weirdly, in the last 3 years, I feel like, because I did all that study, I kind of came to my conclusions. This was in my early 20s. I was all but done on a PhD, but all but done, meaning all but dissertation, at the age of 22. And then I couldn't get a committee to actually do the dissertation I wanted to do. So I went off. I thought I'd just go off and teach for a while. And then we got into mountain guiding and expeditions, and life just happened. And I just kind of put all that stuff up on the shelf. And in the last 3 years, particularly with this rising spike in existential crises, the collapse of our conventional narratives of like business as usual and growth and techno-utopians, and we're going to invent our way to spaceships and singularities. And it was kind of like, oh my gosh, I felt like the Karate Kid, who'd been learning like wax on, wax off, wax on, wax off. And I was like, what the hell is all this for? And then I was like, oh shit, I needed all this stuff for now. So I've been deeply revisiting and rethinking.
He was there.
Yeah, that inquiry of what is the arc of Western civ? Because I mean, here's an example. There's a French DJ, and I don't remember the DJ's name, but they have a YouTube channel that gets millions of views called Circle, Cercle, and they basically take very well-known DJs and then plop them down in World Heritage sites, around the world. These Turkish ruins, the tombs of Ramses in Egypt, and an ice flow surrounded by the Northern Lights in the Arctic Circle, just epic epic locations with just one person on the decks making music with beautiful cinematography. And it was New Year's Eve this year, and we were watching one that was at the tombs of Ramses. It was right by the Aswan Dam where they relocated that entire tomb system. And I've never seen that stuff in high def, shot from a drone, just scanning all these crazy 50-foot tall, sculptures into the stone. And it was just mind bending to look at that amount of human creativity and art and iconography and sacred religiosity and realize, fuck me, man, those guys were going for 3,000 years. We're barely going to squeak to the 300-year mark before we send this thing off a cliff. Who is to say, right, who had the better approach? And so, yes, that inquiry has been the sort of the foundation of my life and always what I've been noticing, trying to learn more about. And then at the same time, this notion, your question about why write Recapture the Rapture, that actually happened by accident, where, back to the music, mountains, mushrooms, and marriage, I was paying attention to all of the neuroscientific studies that connected to optimizing peak states. So ecstatic states, non-ordinary or non-dual states. And basically, anytime I saw information in a research paper that talked about brainwaves that were not conventional waking consciousness, so either gamma brainwaves, which are high frequency bursts that come along with moments of insights, or basically anything that's not beta waves, which is what we're doing, talking to each other, and everybody's doing listening, but down into alpha, down into theta. What are those states? They are often, meditative. That's also where flow states, where you kind of drop into the zone and you're engaged in the task. That's where those show up. But also even deeper into delta states, which is really close to brain dead. Right? It's 0.1 hertz to 4 hertz. It's as close as you can get to flatlining neurologically. So mapping EEG, mapping neurochemistry. So obviously cortisol and norepinephrine, those are stress responders. They give us juice to get up and go and do a hard or scary thing, just activation energy, and all the way to fight flight energy. And of course, in bursts, those are essential. In small, healthy amounts, they're literally what gets us out of bed in the morning. I mean, rising cortisol in the early morning is why we wake up. And it's also why we don't need coffee right away. You should wait 2 hours before you have your coffee. Otherwise, you're just doubling down on maximum cortisol. But there are others like dopamine, like endorphins, like anandamide, right? That are the pain-reducing, pleasure-enhancing, cognition, bonding, oxytocin, serotonin, these kind of chemicals. And just like, okay, basically, if there are, what combination of activities can you do to optimize healthy and even state-inducing neurochemistry, and what behaviors and activities can you do that increase your flexibility of neuroelectric states, right? And of course, anybody who's deeply into the study, actual neuroscientists, there's never just clearly a singular, like, my brain is in alpha. You're like, this part of my brain might be predominantly alpha at this moment. Other parts of our brain, different hemispheres, different regions are all popping off in different ways. So it's a gross simplification to speak of your brain is in or primed by any of these things. But with that disclaimer, basically just started assembling all of this research. And it was kind of shocking because it was like, oh, wow, if you really want to pursue this inquiry, you end up in one of two places. It's really the same place, but it's basically sexy biohacking or nerdy kink. You end up including in your personal optimization sexual arousal, physical networks, not because it needs to be romantic or erotic or sexy or kinky or any of those things. It's simply because the primate nervous system is primarily wired, like our entire ecstatic neural circuitry is maps one-to-one to the sexual arousal network. And that was discovered in the 1950s, right, at the University of Pennsylvania. That's not novel or new. It's just socially taboo. So everybody snickers or twitters or about it. But you're just like, of course. Why? Because monkeys and then apes and then us and every other living organism that reproduces via sexual reproduction, right, has to do it with no instruction manual, no Kama Sutra, no YouPorn, no healthy sexologist on Instagram, right? We had to just figure this shit out blind. And if you think about it, like logistically, it's not the most obvious thing. It's not. But so somehow, right, the tractor beam of evolution had to say, we are going to make this inevitable, which means that evolution through the kitchen sink at the neurochemical prime and hormonal priming and incentives to fumble around and figure it out every single generation without fail, or we would not be here. So once you accept that, you're just like, oh, okay, if I'm an anthropologist from space, just giving humans a user manual, you would be like, pay much, much, much more attention to your sexual circuitry and sexual fitness and health. So that was one, just research finding. I was like, that's interesting, and also equally fascinating that so many people are so squeamish about it, that this isn't common knowledge, which is another bizarre thing. And then you realize, oh, now combine it. What if you just put all of these things, all of these research papers, all of these findings together into some protocols, and you basically end up
with breathing, with and then it's born hedonic engineering, right? Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so basically just kind of identified 5 really consistent drivers. And this, by the way, goes back to that idea of neuroanthropology and studying the past and studying traditional religions, esoteric sects, whatever it would be. Like, how have humans done access to God consciousness? How have they done inspiration and healing and all of these things in the past? And you can kind of realize that you have breathing. So respiration is overwhelmingly a potent tool. And if you think about it, I mean, I use the example of Aboriginal didgeridoo players, right, who are blowing on a didgeridoo using circular breathing. So they're breathing through their nose, squeezing on their cheeks, continuing that drone state, and they play the didgeridoo in order to get to dream time, in order to shift state, drop out. And part of it is just listening, and it's just weird and there's just rhythm and strange sound. But part of it is the actual act of playing. And for instance, at Sweden's Karolinska Institute, they have found that nose breathing, of course, respiration, Wim Hof, the James Nestor's book, Breathe, all of these things have like hit the big time in the last 5 years. So many, many more people are conversant with this stuff now. But, basically that nasal breathing increases nitric oxide production in our brains by 15 times compared to mouth breathing. And obviously, if you're having to do that playing a didgeridoo, right, you are massively boosting nitric oxide. And Herbert Benson at Harvard University wrote a book called The Breakout Principle, which is all about the role of nitric oxide. He called it the spirit molecule or the bliss molecule. And it's it's a neurotransmitter that signals and crosses the blood-brain barrier. So very rare kind of act. Not many things do that. And it flushes out stress, fight, flight, neurochemicals, and physiology, and brings in calm, states of calm connection to transcendence. So you're like, oh, respiration, fascinating, right? But then you also have something like in Catholicism, you have the Hail Mary prayer. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now at the hour of our death. Amen. Right? And Catholics for 1,000 years have been taught that. And you kneel, and you might even kneel in front of votive candles with incense and an icon of the Virgin Mary surrounded by sacred art, dim light, so smells and bells, right? The whole, and I went to 12 years of Catholic
Setting.
school, right? I got all of this. And so weirdly, kneeling is a mild respiratory constriction pattern. Like if you've ever been kneeling and standing up and kneeling and standing up, you realize it kind of changes the shape of our rib cage and the shape of our lungs. So you're doing that, and what you realize is the way people rattle those off typically is about 9 seconds or 9 hertz. So now you've got in the Hail Mary, never mind the lyrics, never mind what it's saying. It's actually a 9 hertz controlled respiratory cycle that actually slips you into alpha. So you're like, and it's same with Om Mani Padme Hum, right? The Tibetan chant, right? Like a lot of these repetitive cyclical things, you can see them as it's the content, And you can also see underneath it, it's a respiratory control pattern that is indexed to actually shift you out of waking beta and into an alpha or theta state. So you're like, oh, and then I received a flash of insight and the Virgin Mary spoke to me, right? Or this Tibetan tanka that I'm staring at
Did
unlocked,
you
and now,
use
right? So respiration, right? These were just a couple of examples from different times and places to say, oh, it's same as it ever was. We've always been doing this stuff. Long before Wim Hof, we were doing this stuff, right? And we were doing it to the effect of inspiration and healing. So respiration is one deep bodily thing. Again, it's one of our primary biological urges. If we don't breathe, we die. So we have incredibly strong urges. When people hold their breath for as long as you can, and then you and your stomach starts spasming and you start getting a little freaky and uncomfortable, and you're like, oh, I have to take a breath. And if you ask most people, they would say it's because I was out of oxygen. I had to get more oxygen. And that's not actually what's happening. We've actually we've got plenty of oxygen, 40 to 60% left at that moment of our first involuntary breath movement. What's actually happening is we've got an uncomfortable buildup of CO2 that we need to blow off. And what that means is that's this enormous safety buffer. So if we were diving for oysters or clams or whatever it might be, that your brain is like, mayday, mayday, get to the surface, get another breath before you actually really do need it and die. And that's why freedivers and even kids monkeying around in pools will sometimes die if they engage in freedive prep, like hyperventilate beforehand, because what that does is it blows off a lot of CO2. And then it artificially depresses my mayday, mayday safety signals. So now I can actually hold my breath so far that I actually do run out of oxygen, but there's no mayday signal for that one. I just pass out. And so you end up in shallow water drownings and those kinds of things. So that's all just kind of geek details, but just to kind of point out some of the nuances and point out some of the neurochemistry and physiology behind it. So that's one. The next is embodiment, right? Our bodies, and very specifically our spinal columns to vagal nerve, and basically the nerve, all the cranial nerves at the base of our brainstem, all the way out through our root, provide incredibly potent tools for reset, for basically discharge of energy and reset of our body and brains. So there's and if you think about, basically we're just worms. We're just tube worms. If you think way back into our biological chain, long before we got little flippers or arms and legs, right? We were just worms with mouths and assholes. And that core structure is still there. And our vagus nerve, which is the wandering nerve, it wanders from our brainstem all the way down to our root, to our pelvic floor, is one of the strongest metronomes responsible for basically our body's equilibrium and health. And so there's tons of pharmacological research, there's tons of biomedical research these days on how do we prime the vagus nerve, how do we do all these things? And what you realize is it's all the spasms of that primitive worm in our system. It's gagging, gargling, singing, laughing, choking, puking, right? All of these things, like the sort of spasmodic contractions are as basic as they ever get. Now, once again, back to social taboos, we're usually embarrassed or ashamed, shitting for that matter, right? I mean, Anish Seth in Princeton as a gastroenterologist, he called it poo-phoria. The idea of taking an especially large bowel movement can leave people sweating. It can leave people with goosebumps. It can even leave with people feeling, oh my gosh, that's amazing, right? Comics will often make jokes about that kind of stuff, right? Scatological humor. And everyone's like, just kind of laughs into their beer. Like, oh, that's funny. That's embarrassing. You said it. I didn't have to, right? That kind of a thing. But he called it poo-phoria. That idea of like you get this ecstatic state from a bowel movement. Well, what's that about? Well, what it is about is actually pressure on the vagal nerve down at the bottom. So you're like, that's all really interesting and not particularly well integrated, right? We've got biomedical companies like talking about installing pacemakers, little electrical medical chips to pulse and trigger our vagal nerve for people that are suffering from everything from chronic inflammation to anxiety and psychological to physiological conditions. But you're like, You could just massage your throat. You could just gargle. You could just engage in pelvic floor awareness. There's all sorts of very simple ways for us to get into and access that. And another one is the endocannabinoid system, right? Arguably, and I haven't seen much research yet on this, of integrating studies on the vagus nerve and studies on the endocannabinoid system, the ECS. And Raphael Mechoulam is a Hebrew, he's Hebrew University, is long-time Israeli scientist and researcher who was kind of the godfather of basically cannabis research. He's the one that discovered anandamide, which is the endogenous neurochemical. So it's the equivalent of endorphins or dopamine. So if dopamine is to cocaine what endorphins are to opium, then anandamide is to cannabis. But what he realized was our bodies and brains have neuroreceptor sites for anandamide. And anybody that has ever heard of runner's high, and people often say, oh, runner's high, when you start feeling really good after suffering, that's endorphins. It's not. It's actually anandamide. And that's potentially been adapted for, hunter-gatherers on, exhaustion, pursuit, hunting styles where they run and run and run until the animal collapses, those kind of things, like second wind, third wind. These things were important for us. But that endocannabinoids actually exist all the way back into ancient sea sponges, like 500 million years ago. So it's not even human. And we've adapted. Now, by sheer fluke, this little five-fingered plant called cannabis that started on the Tibetan plateau like 20 million years ago happens to fit lock and key into the endocannabinoid receptor sites. So if you're, if anybody is hearing, again, in social feeds, in media, like, CBD oil is amazing, or cannabis does this, that, and the other, and it's good for this, and it washes your car, and it helps you be happy, and you don't, and you think, this is a little bit of hype, and I think these people are trying to sell me something. Many of them are, but underneath the hype is actually a very structured reason. It's not about weed. It's about our internal endocannabinoid system, right? And in fact, overuse of cannabis can actually depress and negate our healthily functioning endocannabinoid system. So my point here is to say it's what's in us, that system, the ECS system, not external cannabis. That's the miracle. And interestingly, the endocannabinoid system is responsible from everything from bone growth and healing to healing traumatic brain injuries to adjusting psychologically for anxiety and depression. In fact, strangely, Nigerians have a receptor site in their brain that it works like Prozac. It's a selective anandamide reuptake inhibitor. So instead of a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is Prozac and that whole class of antidepressants, which is basically saying it comes into your brain, it binds to those receptors, and it lets your free serotonin rattle around in your brain, is supposed to make you happier, right? That has been largely disproved, but that was the origin thesis of a blockbuster 30-year Prozac nation, right? But Nigerians just have a genetic mutation where they have natural anandamide reuptake inhibitors, and they are measurably happier and more optimistic and less anxious. So you're like, wow, fascinating. So you take the vagus nerve and you take the endocannabinoid system, and both of them are kind of like metronomes. They sort of set the rhythms of our whole systems, and they make us more resilient. And they tend to heal and patch up. And so when these things are in sync and when these things are thriving, we are typically better off. That's the kind of short answer. And strangely, there's not, in my regard, expecting like nearly enough integrated research on the two of them, because those, to me, like by all the research in each of them, you're looking at them and you're like, these sound really, really similar. And it seems like when one is happy, when one's doing well, the other is likely to be as well. And when one is under stress or is out of whack, then the other is probably, and then you get this cascade of mental and physical disorders or diseases. So we've covered respiration. That was embodiment. I wanted to take the time to unpack these so people can actually not just
Please,
consume
yes.
as a punch list, but actually
Wonderful.
bring it to life, right? And then the next one, right? If respiration is we have to breathe every minute or three or we're dead, so that's super strong. Then embodiment, these, we are worms, we are basically worms with mouths and assholes. And if we learn actually to interact with some of our most ancient, right, priming resilience systems, the endocannabinoid system and our vagus nerve, that can do profound things, as well as even the cross-wiring of pleasure and pain. Like, we're unique as animals. In fact, there's a University of Pennsylvania study on that as well that was saying, different time frame, but more recently, that was basically saying, like, we are kind of unique in the animal kingdom of hot wiring pleasure and pain, or finding certain painful experiences pleasurable. They did studies with animals, and that was everything from giving them spicy peppers to electric shocks to all of these things. And they're like, when an animal experiences that once, they never want to go near it again. The only thing that will prompt them to override it is food. Like, you actually kind of stack it and blackmail them into doing it again, but they will never just try it for kicks. And if you've been in, Andrew Weil, the Harvard physician that kind of went, alternative, has way back in one of his books, he wrote about visiting Oaxaca and in Mexico, and just looking at this habit of eating hot peppers. And even kids, grandmothers, they would do it and they'd go, oh, 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 caliente, caliente, and then they'd smile, laugh, eyes watering, and they'd do it again. And you're like, what is that about? Right? And so that idea that, not surprisingly, right? Pain releases endorphins and has euphoria. Many people who talk about having tattoos, they're like, oh, it's not about the ink. It's not about the picture on my body. It's about the act of getting the tattoo. It's about all of those needles. And if you talk to tattoo artists, most of them will limit their sessions. They'll limit them to, this obviously varies, but they'll limit them to roughly, the sweet spot is like not long, like 60 to 90 minutes. So if they're doing a big, like a sleeve tat or a full back tat or something like that, they will do it in installments. And part of the reason is that the first 10 to 15 minutes are really agony. Then you get into the sweet spot where endorphins have flooded your system and you're off into floaty, dreamy land. And then it wears off. So you have to, so the reason that tattoo artists, other than their own fatigue or that kind of thing, will limit it is because that's fundamentally the lifespan of that endorphin rush that you get to cover the pain and send you into euphoric states. And in my study for this book, this was just accident. I couldn't research this because it's not published anywhere, but there was a woman who was an undercover agent for the federal government researching domestic terror after 9/11. And she was sent to New York to infiltrate the underground vampire community, which I didn't realize was a thing, but is a thing. Apparently there was 70,000 self-identified vampires in New York City. And it was, it was kind of goth. It was very gender bendy, matrixy, all of the things, but they would even have prosthetic fangs that they could retract and hide, but that they were the bouncers and the doormen and the sort of the staff around a couple of these underground kink clubs that were in downtown, right near the Twin Towers. And there would be these restaurants that were these, and so they would have these kind of, the front would be these cabaret, like sexy, kinky cabaret clubs. And sort of tourists would go, and there'd be, titillating menu items, and you could order drinks from a trans man or woman playing it up, and, very campy, very, classically kind of New York theater, whatever. But then there were these underground dungeons underneath, and they would engage in much more intensive BDSM practices. And while this undercover agent was kind of infiltrating this community, she was completely, she fell in love with the people. She's like, these are some of the warmest hearted, most open, kind, caring folks. They're not a threat. So that was kind of in her report. But what they noticed was that a bunch of first responders, so firemen and police from the 9/11 collapse, started coming in and actually wanting to have what she called concerted beatings. So it wasn't sexual. There was no sexuality. There was no climax, release, arousal. It was to be sort of ritualistically whipped and flogged and beaten until, not unlike those tattoo artists, right, they could enter a place which other researchers in Amsterdam and other places have identified as kind of subspace. Like if you're the submissive you're receiving the beating, they call it subspace. And it is this dissociated, dreamy, pleasurable space. But it was also providing cathartic release from survivor's guilt. and some, again, cross-wiring of pleasure and pain. So you're like, my gosh, that is fascinating. Once again, we're the only animals that do this. We've learned to hotwire pleasure and pain, right? And back to spasming, gagging, puking, shitting, sneezing, coming, all of our involuntary responses are actually directly connected to the vagus nerve and vagal nerve health. And then if you take it to the metaphysical level, or even just the, I suppose, sort of philosophical level, you have things like Tonglen, which is the Tibetan practice of compassionate meditation, where instead of sitting and meditating and trying to get to your happy place, like I'm going to let go of all my unhappy negative thoughts and I'm going to cultivate positive happy thoughts. Like that's one of a gajillion versions and subtleties and nuances to meditation. Some meditate on a mantra, you try to get to no thought. Some cultivate happy thoughts. Tonglen does the exact opposite. And it says, actually envision all the suffering you can and visualize it as a black smoke or a sticky tar and actually bring it into your body and then metabolize it and exhale it as light. And so you realize, that's the high, that's the sort of sophisticated or esoteric version. And then you could say the 9/11 first responders being beaten in dungeons is the kind of very physical, almost kind of hard to wrap our head around expression. But you're like, oh my gosh, there is a relationship here between pleasure, pain, suffering, and healing. And very few of us actually understand it, embrace it, and work with it consciously. All right. So that's respiration and embodiment. And basically pleasure, pain, and our core metronomes of endocannabinoid system and vagus nerve. And then you get into the next one, which is sexuality. We've already touched on that idea. If we don't procreate, we die, our genes die, our species die. So super incented and also massively problematic, right? I mean, unconscious, impulsive sexuality is responsible for, arguably over half of our suffering. If you think about, just relational suffering, jealousy, infidelity, accidental pregnancy, abortions, divorces, those kinds of things, you're like, oh my gosh, that's tons. But then on an even basic, just think to something as horrible. I mean, childhood sexual abuse, right? And even
raping,
war rape, right? The idea that conquest almost always included some subjugation and violation sexually, to the point where, Genghis Khan's DNA, right, is now in, I think, 8 to 10% of all Asian men. You're like, holy Moses, like that is a living genetic record of rape and conquest. That's not, he had a bunch of lovers on the side, one in every town. Like that's not what that is. And so and then any geneticists who do deep studies, you're like, there are no races really. We've all been conquering and taking over and interbreeding. And not all of that interbreeding has been elective and consensual. So the key here is to realize evolution is amoral. It doesn't give a fuck what our personal preferences are or have been, or consent, or romance, or love. All it cares about is priming the pump and incenting behavior for the most robust gene pool possible. So that's our default situation with our sexuality. But at the same time, the key to the kingdom is, oh, but wait, this maps one-to-one with our entire ecstatic circuitry. So we can either go through life getting yanked by the strings like puppets of an amoral evolution that does not care about our feelings or our life experiences. Or we can learn to untie those strings and we can say, hey, now can we hotwire evolution? Can we use those same primers and incentives and that same powerful ecstatic reward circuitry, and can we put that towards healing and transcendence and connection? So that's the basic premise of bringing sexual fitness online, and even including it in very explicit versions of healing. And back to that notion of like the vagus nerve and how like spasming, puking, sneezing, shitting, orgasming, all of these things, right, are this quivering, spasming, moment in our nervous systems. And typically afterwards we feel better, right?
And
We
how do
often,
you define sexual fitness? Sorry, I was interrupting you.
oh, that's okay. Well, we can come to that in one sec, right? So you can realize, if anybody's read Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, which is all about how we hold trauma in our bodies, right? You realize that just intuitively, there's been this huge, I mean, in fact, that whole notion of we go through spasms and convulsions and afterwards are calmer, happier, more balanced, was actually the original insight on electroshock therapy. It was like, like blammo, like, and then someone, coming out of seizures, coming out of any of those things, right? Like those experiences, like even 100 years ago, people are like, wait a second, I think there's something there, right? And so you look at things like EMDR, which is eye sensitivity, like, like when you've had trauma, your eye tracking gets
Yes.
jacked up and you can rework it by moving, right? This was intuitively discovered, and I don't think it's all exactly right, but it's barking up the right tree. There's tremor release therapies, where the idea is if you do an isometric hold, like a wall sit, where you're squatting with your back against the wall, or you do a bridge on the ground until your muscles fatigue and you can no longer control your position, and then you start wiggling and wobbling and then even just spasming and losing control. There's a whole host of these modalities that are kind of, and each one is usually some quirky founder that kind of stumbled on something. And then the sad thing is that they've typically branded it, copyrighted it, trying to take it to market. So they get a little fixed in what it is. But if you pan back from it, you see these as subsets of, oh, tremor and spasm and release is a huge part of returning our nervous systems to health and balance. Now you can lay this into pleasure pain, and you can lay this into sexual response. And of course, in sexuality, right, which has been highly stigmatized, highly tabooed, and very socially controlled, precisely because evolution is amoral and generally more powerful than any government. So no government, nobody in charge could stay in charge for very long or stay in control of their people if they didn't also directly attempt to control their people's sexuality with all the
Mm.
taboos, customs, with all of these things. Thou shalt and thou shalt. I mean, the fact that 10 commandments, and one of them is thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, right? You're right there, right there. And, incest taboos, you name it, right? Like we have attempted to put the lid on this thing because it is so powerful and doesn't bend to Romeo and Juliet, right? Like Helen of Troy, like
Romantic
all of
love,
these
yeah.
things, right, are examples of it. So if you go back to how do we make use of it, you have to go and look for who's been into this in the past. And in the Eastern traditions, it was the realms of Tantra or Tantra-like practices. And in the West, it was the realm of what is sometimes just kind of called sex magic, but like not rabbits out of a hat, but actually looking to, basically reformat human physiology and consciousness and potentially outcomes in the world via the cultivation of sexual energy in partners. And so you kind of, take this current neuroscience research, look at Tantra and sex magic and be like, okay, well, these guys were the kind of explorers and the pioneers. It's very hard to kind of get to the bottom of what they were doing because it's usually, hidden. It's, there's metaphors, there's analogies, there's secrets within secrets. There's all this kind of stuff to sift through. But if you look at it very straightforward, you're like, oh, the, basically the postponing of male orgasm and the cultivation and extension of female orgasm to get to a place of neurochemical saturation, right, that allows for a non-ordinary state of consciousness and a resetting or reformatting of the human nervous system has real power. And then fill in the blank. Different groups took it in different directions. Has the power to then manifest what you want. Casting a spell has the power to make you more compassionate or kind. Whatever it would be, right? They take that juice and then deploy it. And one big breakthrough in the research, as I was preparing for this book, came when I was on a panel with Rick Doblin, who's a Harvard researcher who founded the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And if anybody has heard of the phase 3 research on MDMA, the chemical, often, the degraded versions are known as ecstasy and Molly and other things, but the actual pure research chemical is MDMA, and its use in trauma, use in PTSD studies. And it's been off the charts, right? I mean, to the point where even the DEA, and the FDA have been sort of, fast tracking it. They're like, this is amazing. We need to get this to our veterans. There's so many people coming out of wars and everything else. Like, this is doing incredible things, 10 times more effectively than the existing stuff we have, the Prozacs and the anti-anxieties and the antipsychotics and that kind of stuff. And I asked him, I said, well, what are you guys finding? And he said, well, interestingly, we're finding a high degree of prolactin, oxytocin, vasopressin, and in these states. So you're giving a patient the chemical. It is then triggering these neurochemicals in their bodies and brains. And then with the help of a therapist, they're then able to go back to a traumatic memory, but they feel safe, they feel connected, they feel open, and they're able to revisit them without being re-traumatized, right? So they're able to then talk about them. They're able to work with them. And many people think of memories are like a photo album. They're just kind of, that was that moment in time. But the reality is our memories are constantly plastic and constantly being updated. The obvious studies have been flashbulb memory moments, like where were you when JFK was shot, or the Twin Towers came down, or the Space Shuttle Challenger crashed, or whatever it be. And they'd interview people day of, a week later, a month later, a year later, a decade later, and they realized, oh, and people will swear blind. I remember it's just as clear as the day. I was in my living room and I was there with my brother. She's like, but wait, the day of, you said you were at a Starbucks. What gives? So memory is plastic. Or an easy one is happy wedding photos. And then 10 years later, you're divorced. And you look at that photo and your memory of that day is 100% different than what it was day of. So in trauma research, they're finding that by putting people into these supersaturated states of high vasopressin, oxytocin, serotonin, and a host of other, kind of cascading neurochemicals, that they're able to rework those memories, those traumatic memories that have haunted them, and they're able to kind of put them back on the shelf a little better, right? A little safer, a little bit more, in a more empowering, healing way. And he said, funnily enough, the closest analog or comparison we have to that is the post-orgasmic state. And you're like, holy moly, right? So you guys have spent 30 years and $100 million jumping through hoops to get this little pill available, or you could potentially prime people, like comparable with the practices of Tantra and sex magic, into that supersaturated state. And you could potentially engage in trauma work and healing from that place, right? And so now, so hold that thought and then add in the final two. So we've discussed three so far, right? Respiration, embodiment, sexuality. And then you can just think of a couple of accelerators, right? Or force multipliers, because those three are all bodily, right? They're as close to evolutionary imperative as we have. We have to breathe. We're in our bodies alive, and we have to procreate. So those are very long levers, right? That's like the Archimedes thing of give me a lever long enough and I can move the world. Those are really long levers to biohack, basically. And then you can think of amplifiers or multipliers. What makes those things work even better? And two of the most prominent are substances, aka what we just described with the MDMA. Like, can I actually ingest something that shifts my state predictably and reliably? And then music, which might seem like a left turn. You're like, wait, how do we get to music? But music, according to Daniel Levitin at McGill University in Canada, actually predates language in the evolution of the human species. It was arguably one of our core tools for coherence and social bonding and priming, communication, as well as its powerful state shifting capacities. Shifting in brainwave states, what is known as sonic driving or musical entrainment, right? Where funky beats, right, actually shift our brains and take us out of our default mode network, take us out of executive function and into some other more embodied and receptive states. So you're like, okay, so now we've got all five together. And you're like, well, what happens if we put them all together? And what happens if you put them all together is on the low level, and I don't mean this in a diminished way, I just mean kind of altitude. On the low level, you can put them all together into a sexual yoga of becoming. So a dedicated, recurring practice that involves body work, right? It involves rolling out, involves soft tissue integration, spinal mobility, breath work, all of these kind of things. Also, and this is true for, there's a reason, for instance, that like Thai massage, people, again, snicker about, can I get a happy ending, right? The idea of like an orgasmic release, right? Combined with body work. It's seen as shady. It's seen as covert prostitution, etc. But we know some really advanced body workers that actually do happy middles because they actually engage in sexual release, not at the end so I can pull up my trousers and go back to work and don't tell the wife, but so I can actually have that physiological cascade and be more relaxed and more receptive for the rest of the structural integration and body work. So this is a total gray zone right now. There are no cleanly sanctioned places to do it. And many of the practitioners that do this kind of stuff either get called out because other puritanical people don't know what they're looking at and judge it and persecute it, or because they themselves, because they're outside the pale of social rules and regulations, are kind of doing it badly themselves, or get hijacked by their own sexuality and impulses, and then it's no longer safe or good, right? So this is not riskless terrain, right? And back to our original analogy of climbing in a climbing gym versus high altitude mountaineering, this is the equivalent of high altitude mountaineering. You absolutely can mess, you can fuck yourself up and die, or go insane, right? Or kill yourself. Like this is very, very potent set of tools if taken to their conclusion. But just because someone, if you wouldn't just go up to Mount Everest wearing your windbreaker and a pair of blue jeans and go wandering up there and fall off the side of the mountain or die of frostbite and have people be like, we should blow up that mountain, it's the mountain's fault. You're like, no, you should have really, really prepared for what you're doing, and you should learn safety and systems and risk and have training partners and safe, and all those things together. So just, full disclaimer that putting all of these things together has only ever been practiced by mystics and monks, and it's been kept under wraps for a reason. But at the same time, part of the impetus for this book was we are almost out of time in a world of hurt. So we really do need to be able to open source these tools, because they are, the good news is they're not expensive, they're not esoteric, and everybody can do this for themselves. They can practice these things in their central core relationships, and we can all learn to metabolize our grief, stay connected and centered, have loving partnerships and families, be courageous and inspired, engage the world from a position of safety, security, wholeness, and then hopefully show up and make a difference. So, I'm weaving a couple of threads here, and we'll kind of get back to the finishing details on the sexual yoga of becoming. But fundamentally, just why did I write this book is because I felt like, we stumbled into this particular set of the sexual yoga of becoming by accident. We were just collecting research, and we're like, I wonder if this stuff all works. And then we put it together, and we're like,
All
oh my
putting
God,
together.
it works better than you can imagine. This is crazy. I cannot believe this is not on the front cover of Time magazine.
And what are your favorite set of practices on hedonic engineering? The ones you practice all them all, or
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to finish, right? So we said on the low level, these kinds of practices, so breath work plus body work, literally like myofascial, soft tissue, rolling out, theraguns, like percussive massage, those kinds of things, by yourself or with a partner, is all beautiful. Then if you include sexual arousal to create the neurochemistry that's similar to those MDMA trauma work, you can then have access to, healing. You can revisit painful past things, and it just is safer. And by the way, you're also bonding and connecting with a practice partner, right? And then if you consciously engage substances, not hedonistically, but very specifically, sort of medically and therapeutically, you can shift states. And there's a very good recent book by one is an Oxford ethicist, and the other is, I think, a Yale. I believe, I don't think they're both ethicists. I feel like the Yale fellow might be somebody different, but the book is called Love Drugs. And it's basically
Mm.
making the case that we already use drugs all the time with sexuality. And that's everything from oysters and chocolate as imagined aphrodisiacs, all the way to alcohol, which is implicated in something like 60 to 70% of date rapes and sexual violence, lowered inhibitions, all these kind of things, all the way to birth control pills and antidepressants. So birth control pills, you know, hormonal birth control pills massively upset a woman's natural cycle and dull her sexual response and dull her satisfaction. Not always, but in many cases and kind of statistically. And for sure, SSRIs and Prozac and all of those just crush your libido. So you might not feel as depressed, but you've just been cut off from the central
Mm.
life force of I would like to procreate, which just as an organism, you just realize, whoa, that's pretty low down my hierarchy, right? And like I don't even care to make more life or propagate my genes. That's a bummer. That's a harsh trade-off. So the point in the book, Love Drugs, is just to say we're already mixing drugs and sexuality. We're just doing it really badly and unconsciously. And what if we brought in different compounds to make a positive difference? And that's everything from cannabinoids, right, to access our endocannabinoid system, to MDMA to increase therapeutic intimacy, connection, processing, to a host of other compounds. So the idea there is bringing those all in together, and then also making deliberate use of music to
Mm.
set rhythm, time, and place. I mean, everybody jokes about you know John Legend or or Enya or Yanni at the Acropolis, like putting on the vibey music to get busy, like that kind of a thing. But the idea is like, no, actually deliberate music, especially with like good high fidelity, loud sound and not overbearing, but just like to the point where it takes up your mind, is also a really powerful thing. And then you can, so on the base level, you can use sexual fitness on a daily to weekly ongoing basis to discharge your nervous system from stressors and potentially even go back. That's the micro PTSD. And then potentially even in intense situations, go into true adverse life events, actually revisit traumatic experiences from the past. And in that environment, engage in reworking those memories and coming to better healing and wholeness. So that's the basic level. And then the upper level is back to all of those research papers, right? Because over time, what happened, we said, well, here's all the research papers. What happens if we put these different practices together using those 5 different interventions? Do they work? And the answer is they work amazingly well. And they basically appear to create the simplest, back to the anthropology, is a death rebirth protocol. Like in all human cultures, there's been some death rebirth initiation, right? The whole St. Paul, I think, said, die before you die, right? Goethe said, he who doesn't know the secret, die and become, will remain forever a stranger on this earth. The depth psychologist James Hillman, who wrote about suicide and the soul, he's like, look, the suicidal impulse is actually legit. Like we're all freaked out about it. Roman law, Christian law, common law, like you can't do that. That's really bad. You don't get your insurance. You'll go to hell, whatever. Right. But he's like, no, because his reality, the death impulse is we didn't choose to be born the first time. Our parents got together, evolution's amoral, out popped me. I didn't have any say in this. I come into the world, it's cold and harsh. I'm booted out of the womb where it was warm and safe, and then the rest of my life is just scary and confusing and sad. And I want out. And so out could be I shop a bunch, or I get addicted to gaming or porn or my social feeds or psychedelics. I'm just trying to get the hell out of Dodge. I'm spiritually bypassing my commitments, my responsibilities, because I never said yes in the first place. And what a death rebirth experience does is it actually allows us to have that choice again of like, oh my God,
Wow.
I'm nearly off this mortal coil. I actually now love and cherish and appreciate my life. This is the Ebenezer Scrooge with the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future. This is Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. Like, Dorothy hates Kansas. She hates her farm in Kansas. Like, this is flat ass and dusty and dull. I would do anything to have a life of adventure and mystery. And then Dorothy's big epiphany is there's no place like home. But she has to go to Oz to have that embodied experience. This is Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, the home,
Yes.
away, home. And it's also even the Zen ox herding parable in Japanese Zen, right? Which is finding enlightenment. You go chasing the ox through the jungle, you
And it's
find it,
already there.
you become it, and then there's nothing and no one. And then ultimately, which is kind of cool, but kind of confusing and hard to pay your bills and shop for groceries. But then the final one is, you know, his doors and windows are locked, and even the wisest scholars cannot find him. He is down in the marketplace among the people with helping hands, right? And so that experience, like, is not just historical, metaphorical, allegorical. It's actually real. It's very, very straightforward. You're like, oh, okay, get out of beta wave states and get into alpha, theta, and even down into delta wave, the super low EEG state, right? Replace cortisol and norepinephrine with dopamine, oxytocin, endorphins, and anandamide in your internal neurochemistry, right? Engage in different breathing patterns from hyperventilation all the way to static apnea and breath holding, right? Skillfully ingest certain substances that contribute to those other things, specifically cannabinoids, potentially oxygen, nitrous oxide, carbogen, which is a high blend of carbon dioxide and oxygen, ketamine, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, any of those things also, MDMA, 2CB, and some of these are research chemicals.
Psilocybin
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on the
or not?
dosages, what pairs well with your actual experience. And Alexander and Anne Shulgin, Alexander Shulgin was the sort of master chemist who published Pikal and Tikal. He was kind of the godfather of resuscitating MDMA, along with hundreds of other research chemicals, but also propagating them in therapeutic use. And his partner was a therapist. They were arguably like a psychedelic sex magic tantra couple. Like because they were, old, they were in their 70s and then 80s, as most people came to be aware of them. They're sort of like, oh, that's grandma and grandpa. Grandma and grandpa got freaky deaky and documented all of their studies. They even had a category for erotic on the compound. So they would spend tons of time actually engaging in those things, right? So, but the point being is that this Death-Rebirth protocol, that is normally the realm of poetry, literature, religion, is actually fucking 9 steps. And if you punch the button on those 9 steps, and let's just think if there's any others. Oh, vagal nerve stimulation, nitric oxide optimization, right? If you do all those things and then you time it with music and you time it with pleasure pain and you time it with orgasmic or physiological climax, you stand a better than zero chance of lobbing yourself into a basically what we would provisionally just call the information layer. You suddenly have a non-ordinary state while you're in delta waves. And MIT anesthesiologists did a study, this one specifically with nitrous oxide, but there have been some Stanford studies with ketamine and other things, which is that delta wave activity creates a disembodied dissociative experience that is massively information rich. And in the nitrous oxide study, they realized that, if you breathe 50-50 oxygen, nitrogen, like nitrous oxide, like dentists would do, after several minutes to the point where your bloodstream gets saturated and those kind of things, then you end up with double amplitude delta wave activity. So twice the height of what normally happens in deep and dreamless sleep. And they're like, whoa, never saw that before. What's that about? But as William James and hundreds of others, through history have found, is that nitrous oxide produces profound instantaneous illumination. Now, the trick is most people can't hold on to the insights, right? But then Carl Deisseroth, who was at Stanford, did studies on ketamine and dissociation in both mice and epileptic humans, and gave them enough, ketamine to then be dissociated. For the mice, it was like bumping around and not knowing how to find the maze. For the people, it was self-reporting. But then mapped the brain and realized, there's actually delta wave EEG activity while the subjects are reporting dissociated state. So far, that's just a drug study. But then they took the next step and they're like, what if we neuroelectrically stimulate the brain back into that delta wave state with no ketamine? And they had the same dissociative out-of-body experience. And by the way, those dissociative out-of-body experiences have been positively correlated with the antidepressive effects of the drug. So you're like, it's not the drug, it's the delta wave EEG. And you can get there by a host of different interventions. Some of them are pharmacological, some of them are neuroelectrical, some of them are psychosexual, some of them are respiratory, right? So you're like, oh, the secret within the secret, because people get so fixated on the doorway. Is that one good or bad? Is it legal or illegal? Is it approved or not approved? Is it whatever? And the answer is like, go through the doorways, go through all the doorways, find the central point that they deliver you to, and now you have a complete toolkit. And if any specific intervention or protocol doesn't match or agree with your moral, legal, ethical, or cultural value systems or allowances, you just ignore that one. Swap it out for something that does. And the only rule of thumb, because any one of these things, respiration, embodiment, sexuality, music, substances, any one of them can deliver you to your destination. It's just that in combination, you can get further, faster, with more control. You have more trim tabs, right? If I just take a heroic dose of ayahuasca, I'm on a 12-hour ride, and I hope, I'm just crossing my fingers, that somewhere at the top of that rocket curve, there's 45 to 60 minutes of health and healing and insight, and it's not too sketchy or scary on either side. I don't puke my guts out till I'm wrung out, and I don't have any other wiggy shit happen when I'm really fucking tired, and I'm in the fetal position just waiting for this all to stop so I can go to sleep. Right? So like, and instead you can go from that, which is basically right. So because I mean it's strange, it's weird in these non-ordinary states, and when our body is fatigued, our mind is less resilient, and we might even, but there might have been something absolutely profound, but I was cross-eyed and drooling at the time it came through, and I don't remember it to let it be healing. I don't have enough energy or gas in my tank. That's not to diminish sacred rituals and substances. There's profound impacts on those things, but they do have downsides, not the least of which is scheduling them, right? And how do I fit this in? There's a reason there's so much more psilocybin research in Johns Hopkins and Imperial than there is LSD research right now. It's not that there was some specific benefit to psilocybin over LSD. It was that psilocybin can be fit into a 6 to 8 hour hospital shift, and LSD was typically 10 to 12 hours, and it was a clusterfuck to staff and oversee those studies, right? So basically, if we start taking a move, when you combine this sexual yoga of becoming, that's arguably, a working title for all of these things put together, the kind of that sexual fitness practice. When you combine them all together and you use, for instance, the substances you do choose to use are shorter half-life, meaning just metabolically, they take less time to go through your system to the point where you're back on the ground and sober and functional again. Then you go from, basically wavelength, how long does it take? You shorten the wavelength to 1 to 3 hours, and you put them all together so you can boost the amplitude. So you're actually trying to get as high up into the realms of inspiration, information, processing, insight, healing, innovation, whatever there's for you to grab. And you come back and don't fumble the football in the end zone, to use an American term, right? Like you make the catch, you catch the magic, the thing that's yours to learn, and you don't let go of it on impact back into 3D. So that's the other half, right? We said the lower end is just processing micro PTSD, having the time to undo and unpack our deeper healing, kind of the macro PTSD. That's good and steady, even if you never punch through to those higher realms. But on the other hand, if you put them all together, you will consistently have a death-rebirth experience, right? Which can lead to, it's fundamentally like the cheat codes to the universe. It's ridiculously powerful. And then, okay, now all in service of what? Right? All in service of what? Because this would effectively just be superhedonism, right? If there wasn't a deeper point. And arguably, the point is to have that twice-born experience, to realize, oh my gosh, I have physiologically basically had that death-rebirth experience. I have gone to the brink, and I am now coming back into this world with helping hands, with an open heart, with joy, with gratitude and appreciation. And it's not that everything works out perfectly. It's that we cultivate that bliss bug, right? Literally the white light, neck snapping pleasure and mind bending bliss of this thing, right? We cultivate that in order to be able to, we cultivate the ecstasy so that we can endure and bear witness to the agony. Because the good news and bad news of those peak states and those experiences is they, you get access to, universal content, but you also get a punch
You're
list
right.
of everything that you still need to do to be in integrity.
Need to work out.
You get your homework. And not only do we get our own homework, but if you stay in this practice enough, you will often have some deep experiences of the pain and the suffering and the injustices of the world. You experience the wound of the world as well. And that will crush you if you don't have the love and the light and the wholeness and the inspiration to counterbalance it. And if you hold both of those together, right, you experience these moments in the deep now, right, what scholars would call kairos, right, the timeless present. And then you come back down into the day-to-day, what they would also call chronos, clock time, right? That is the intersection, right? Kairos is the vertical pole and chronos is the horizontal. And in the esoteric traditions, like that's the understanding of the crucifixion. That's the understanding of the rosy cross, not anything to do with Jesus of Nazareth, not anything to do with 2,000 years of organized bureaucratic Christianity. Just set all that aside and just take this as a fresh metaphor. But it's fundamentally, what does it mean to become, fundamentally that process, Teilhard de Chardin, the French Jesuit, called Christogenesis, the process of becoming Christ consciousness, which is basically nothing other than say, I am immortal and I'm aware of heaven and hell, and I'm not wiggling off the hook for bearing witness to the full catastrophe that is this human experience. And just the final metaphor, because I know we've been going long on this, right? The final metaphor is, what does that then do? We choose to be a twice-born human. We choose to come back into this world with an open, bleeding, joyful heart, right? Both at the same time. Then we have this capacity to unlock what Martin Luther King called soul force, right? He's, in his I Have a Dream speech, he said, when we can meet physical force with soul force, right, we have a chance. That came from Gandhi. He called it satyagraha, right, which was truth and integrity aligned. We've seen this with Mandela. We've seen this in the social protest movements around the world that have emphasized this nonviolence, which is it sends shockwaves through the world. It topples tyrants. It restores our mutuality and our humanity. It gives us the courage to do the things that are ours and ours alone to do. So in this notion of rethinking God, sex, and death in a world that's lost its mind, right, our capacity to initiate ourselves and each other into becoming twice-born humans that can access authentically radical hope. Like, we know this is going to work out somehow. Maybe not in our lifetime, maybe not long, maybe how long, but someday. And we're going to take our stand for what we know to be true, regardless of the consequences to ourselves. Right? We cease to become the Homo sapiens seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, right? Just little impulsive, fucking cowardly monkeys, basically. And we have a chance to become noble. And we have a chance to do what we must for the least of our brothers and sisters, right? And to me, that is the only curve that bends in the right direction right now. If you look at existential risk, if you look at climate reports, if you look at geopolitical surveys and all these things, most of it's pretty grim. And most of it heads off a cliff of one shape or another in the next 10 to 50 years, right? So our only exponential curve that bends in the right direction is a mass grassroots movement to Meaning 3.0, inclusive salvation that we do for ourselves and each other, and that we take a stand for goodness, truth, and beauty, right, around the world in 1,000 different ways, right, to try and steer this ship, to try and steer this civilization into something that works for everybody and delivers on the hope that we all have.
Oh, Jamie, what was the most outstanding? Because about hedonic engineering, I must assume that the cost, as you were saying, is not as higher as all the rituals and the shamanic practices and all the things that are most outside of our control. These kind of practices, we can get it. We can do it by ourselves, but not do it by ourselves. If I understood well, they are coming not at a high cost. So this is it true?
Would you say, do you mean literally like monetary cost, or do you mean sort of?
No, I mean the cost of hedonic engineering is not as critical or can be damaging, or because our control, sexuality, like also all the practices, breathing, movement, are more available to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, make no mistake, this is T.S. Eliot. He said, like, ultimate truth comes at a cost not less than everything. So back to that high altitude mountaineering, I wouldn't have written this book if the world wasn't losing its mind. But we stand a non-zero chance of societal collapse to outright extinction in the next century, and in a way that humans have never faced. We've always had pockets of crisis and conflict and this and that, but it's been regional, right? We've never had the whole thing happen all at once. And so I took huge risks to write this book. There's nothing professional or calculated that laying all of these things out in one book supports. And in fact, even the idea of fitting it all in, because it's a ton, like it's very, very, very dense. Way more dense than Simply Stealing Fire, which was a series of fun, engaging stories of 1,500 words each. And I was like, actually, I want this to all be between two covers because I don't know who will need this information when, but I do feel compelled to put it all in one place. And ultimately, we shall see, right? We shall see how this all takes shape. But at the bare ass minimum, this is a way to find ourselves, to remember what we've forgotten, and to rebuild conscious culture from scratch.
What was the most astonishing thing you find out while you were writing the book?
I mean, it was the entire process. The entire process was actually transcribed from experiences in that information layer, having these death-rebirth experiences. So it was basically 7 years of research with a iPhone voice memo, coming back from those places and being like, get a load of this. You'd never believe it. Holy shit, what is going on and what is this about? And then feeling like there was just no way to sit on that or just take that to my grave. So, but I couldn't write the story that way because that would have sounded batshit. So instead, I kind of did the Malcolm Gladwell, like, I'm going to take a look at these things and we're going to visit the fireman and the neuroscientist and, and the base jumper, and we're going to see what's out there today. But that's not actually how it happened at all. I had to completely turn the story inside out and hide how it actually came through, because that just seemed like best left for fiction. So yeah, I mean, that's all I'm doing is doing my level best to make it fun, engaging, accessible, credible, and then the people that hear that signal and are drawn to it, more power to all of us.
Final message for anyone who is listening this podcast and watching this video.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest is stay awake If you have breakthrough experiences, cherish them and remember them and act on them. Build stuff, like actually create things in the world that are increasing the peace, that are creating more goodness, more truth, more beauty, and help out. There's a ton of people in the world that need our efforts, and if we're all here on fancy computers with nice Wi-Fi and watching streaming podcasts in our spare time, then we are the 1% of the 1% of all humans who have ever lived. So stay awake, build stuff, and help out.
Jamie Wheal, thank you so much. Where people can find you on the internet?
Yeah, so I mean, we're kind of everywhere. This, Facebook, Flow Genome, Instagram, the same, Flow Genome. There's a bunch of podcasts with our own Homegrown Humans podcast, with tons of the people that are in the book and many thought leaders and mentors of ours. Lots of other podcasts we're doing like this one, and then Flow Genome Project.com. We do trainings on this content. We do trainings on personal performance and optimization, and we do live adventure leadership in beautiful places, the mountains and the canyons, and then summertime gatherings as well. So we get together in real life and gather this community, and we also help folks learn long distance of putting these pieces together.
We'll make sure we put all the links in the show notes, and thank you for your time. Thank you for the book and for so detailed and well explanation, and good luck. And again, thank you.
Yeah, great to be here, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks. This is Jamie Wheal for Disrupt Everything podcast series. You'll have the podcast, the transcription, also a summary in Spanish, and all the podcast show notes in also links. And remind yourself and remember that if you don't disrupt yourself, someone will come or something will come and disrupt you that will be more painful. That's for sure. Thank you for being in Disrupt Everything.